While the Senate doors prepare to lock for recess, a legislative game of ping-pong over the Department of Homeland Security has reached a sudden, freezing halt, leaving the nation's border strategy in a state of procedural paralysis.
It is the kind of legislative friction that often gets glossed over as simple partisan bickering, but the transcript from yesterday, Thursday, shows it is actually a very specific collision of Senate Rule 22 and some very stubborn math. Since we have a bit more space to unpack the mechanics today, we can really look at how those procedural gears actually ground to a halt.
The record shows hours of debate just on the motion to proceed, with Senator James Lankford, a Republican from Oklahoma, and Senator Patty Murray, a Democrat from Washington, navigating a minefield of amendments that at several points seemed almost designed to fail. It was a masterclass in the slowdown as a political tool.
Exactly. And beyond that DHS stalemate, we are also digging into a sudden resurgence of the right to repair debate on the House floor, and a curious moment where a discussion on maritime security turned into a deep dive on 1970s shipping manifests. It is one of those "how did we get here" moments that actually explains a lot about the current logjam.
It was a dense day for the record, but it all starts with that standoff over at the Department of Homeland Security. The legislative ping-pong hits a wall. Picking up where we left off, the Senate floor yesterday, Thursday, felt less like a deliberative body and more like a high-stakes chess match, where one side decided to simply flip the board. We are looking at the fallout of House Bill 7147, the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act for 2026. For anyone keeping a calendar, we are well past the initial deadline. This specific stalemate has been freezing essential services since the partial shutdown began, back on February 13th, 2026.
And since we have the room to really stretch our legs and look at the mechanics today, we should talk about what that flip-the-board moment actually looked like in the record. It wasn't a dramatic speech or a filibuster. It was a procedural maneuver called a motion to table. Senator John Thune, a Republican from South Dakota, stood up and essentially told the House that their latest offer wasn't even worth a counter-argument. He asked the chair to lay a message before the Senate, which was the House's version of the DHS bill, and then he immediately moved to kill it.
The transcript is remarkably brief for such a consequential moment. The record shows Senator Thune saying, "Mr. President, I move to table the House message." And just like that, the presiding officer put it to a vote, and the motion was agreed to. There was no long-winded debate at that specific juncture, because the lines had already been drawn in the sand weeks ago. By tabling the message, the Senate was signaling that the legislative ping-pong, that back and forth where each chamber tweaks a bill and sends it back, was officially over.
It's a fascinating bit of parliamentary cold shouldering. Usually, if you disagree with an amendment, you might send back a message in disagreement or request a conference committee to iron out the details. But tabling is the legislative equivalent of return to sender. It doesn't just reject the House's ideas, it removes the entire topic from the immediate floor agenda. It effectively tells the House of Representatives, "We aren't playing this game by your rules anymore."
And the rules the House wanted to play by were very specific. This all comes down to the number $5.4 billion. That is the amount of money the House wanted to earmark specifically for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, operations. When the Senate originally passed their version of this bill back on March 25th, 2026, they had stripped that money out. That was thanks to an amendment from Senator Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine, which reflected a bipartisan, if fragile, consensus in the Senate to decouple that specific ICE funding from the broader DHS package to get the rest of the department open.
Right. The Senate's logic was that they could fund the Coast Guard, the TSA, and disaster relief while they fought over the more contentious immigration policies later. But the House didn't see it that way. They sent the bill back to the Senate yesterday with that $5.4 billion restored, plus some very firm language regarding detention beds and deportation flights. When that message arrived in the Senate, Senator Thune's move to table it was a clear message that the Senate majority And even some Republicans, like Senator Collins, weren't going to let the House dictate the terms of the ICE debate using the rest of the DHS budget as leverage.
If you look at the research context here, this isn't the first time the Senate has balked. Back in late January, they passed a minibus spending bill that completely excluded DHS funding. They gave themselves a 2-week window to figure it out, but that window shattered on February 13th. Since then, we've seen a series of stopgap measures and failed votes. Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, was actually the only member of his party to cross lines back in February to support a House-led DHS bill, which really illustrates how lonely that middle ground has become.
It's a desert out there. And while these senators are moving to table messages and citing Rule XXII, the real-world consequences are mounting. We're talking about TSA agents working without a guarantee of when their next full paycheck will clear, though there was a temporary fix for that recently, and border security operations running on fumes. There was a moment in the record yesterday where the discussion took a very strange detour into maritime security that actually highlights why this funding gap is so complicated to bridge.
I'm glad you caught that. It was during the preliminary debate before the tabling motion. A few members started digging into how DHS handles cargo manifests. It turned into this deep dive on shipping laws from the 1970s. The point they were making, and it was a subtle one, is that our current maritime security infrastructure is being forced to operate under these legacy frameworks because the modernization money is trapped in this HR 7147 stalemate. We are trying to secure 2026 ports with 1976 paperwork requirements because Congress can't agree on how many ICE beds to fund.
It is a procedural dead end. The detail about the 1970s manifests was so specific because it pointed out that some of the automated scanning technology the Department of Homeland Security wants to deploy can't even be legally integrated yet. The legislative authority to update those manifests is tucked into the very bill that Senator Thune just moved to table. So, by stopping the bill over the ICE disagreement, they are also inadvertently stopping a dozen other nonpartisan security upgrades that everyone actually agrees on.
That is the collateral damage of the all-or-nothing strategy. After the Senate finished its business, a message had to be sent back to the House to let them know their amendment was dead. The record includes a formal announcement from the Senate clerk, Ms. Lasky. She announced that the Senate disagrees to the amendment of the House of Representatives to the amendment of the Senate to the bill HR 7147. It sounds like a tongue twister, but in the world of the Capitol, those are fighting words. It means the ball is now back in the House's court, but the Senate has essentially deflated the ball.
And the timing couldn't be worse. Both chambers are heading into a recess until mid-April. Senator Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York and the majority leader, has already characterized the House's insistence on the ICE funding as dead on arrival. So, we are looking at least another 2 weeks of a partially shuttered Department of Homeland Security. The House did pass a 2-month continuing resolution on March 28 to try and keep the lights on until May 22. But the Senate isn't biting on that either. They want a full-year deal, not another bridge to nowhere.
There was one last bit of procedural belt and suspenders work that Senator Thune did after the tabling motion that I think is worth explaining for people who don't spend their lives reading the Senate Journal. After the motion was agreed to, he asked for unanimous consent that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. We see that phrase all the time, but in this context, it's the final nail in the coffin. It's a way of preventing any other senator from coming back an hour later and asking for a revote. It finalizes the action.
It's the legislative version of no backsies, and it really underscores the lack of trust. You only use that move when you are certain that the other side might try to exploit a moment of low attendance or a shift in the room to flip the result. By laying the motion to reconsider on the table, Thune ensured that the Senate's rejection of the House's $5.4 billion ICE plan is the final word of the week.
Earlier in the day, we saw Senator James Lankford, a Republican from Oklahoma, and Senator Patty Murray, a Democrat from Washington, trying to navigate a series of other amendments. They were looking at everything from cybersecurity grants to the E-Verify system. But all of that work is essentially on ice, pun intended, because of the breakdown over HR 7147. You could see the frustration in the dry language of the transcript. There's a point where the acting president pro tempore just starts cycling through the motions, because there's no more productive conversation to be had.
Wait, did you notice the brief mention of the disaster response funding? The House bill had $26.5 billion for disaster relief. That is a massive sum of money for FEMA, especially considering the spring storm season is starting to ramp up. By tabling the House message, the Senate is also putting that disaster money in limbo. It's not just about the border or ICE. It's about the federal government's ability to cut checks when a tornado hits the Midwest or a hurricane hits the Gulf.
The record shows the House Appropriations Committee was quite proud of that $26.5 billion figure when they advanced the bill back in January. They waived points of order to make sure that money could move quickly. But in the Senate's eyes, that disaster aid was being used as a sweetener to force them to accept the ICE funding they find objectionable. It's the classic appropriations trap. You wrap something everyone needs around something one side hates, and then you wait to see who blinks first. Yesterday, the Senate refused to blink.
And while they wait, the operational impact on the ground is getting harder to ignore. We saw references in the House debate to the Vulcan standoff and the combat injury trap, issues where veterans and DHS employees are getting caught in the crossfire of these funding lapses. The Senate's refusal to even debate the House's latest amendment suggests they are banking on the public's desire for a clean bill, outweighing the House's push for these specific America First priorities.
It's a gamble. If the shutdown continues through the April recess, the pressure on both sides will be immense. But as of yesterday, Thursday, the message from the Senate was clear. The current House proposal is a non-starter. They've essentially cleared the floor and told the House to start over. And that leads us directly into a very clever, or perhaps desperate maneuver that's been bubbling up in the House Republican caucus to bypass this exact Senate blockade.
You're talking about the escape hatch.
Exactly. The ICE escape hatch. Let's look at how the House is trying to reroute that $5.4 billion without the Senate's permission.
Before we jump into the escape hatch strategy, we should really look at how Senator Patty Murray, the Democrat from Washington, was framing this from the leadership perspective. In the lead-up to Thune's motion, there was this recurring theme in the remarks about institutional integrity. The Senate Democrats have been making the case that the House is trying to rewrite the rules of the appropriations process by inserting what they call poison pill policy riders into a basic funding bill.
And the House's retort, which we saw in the messages communicated yesterday, is that the money is the policy. If you fund a certain number of detention beds, you are making a policy choice. If you don't fund them, you're making a different one. It's why this DHS bill is always the most radioactive piece of legislation on the Hill. It's where the abstract debate over border security turns into hard numbers. And those numbers are very hard to agree on.
The record actually shows a brief moment where the Senate clerk had to read out the full title of the House's further amendment, and you can almost hear the exhaustion in the room. It's an act making further consolidated appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2026, and for other purposes. That other purposes part is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It includes everything from the cybersecurity of our power grid to the protection of former presidents.
It's a lot to table. But by doing it, Senator Thune has effectively frozen the clock. As we head into this recess, the Department of Homeland Security remains a House divided, or rather, a department unfunded. The legislative ping-pong ball has hit the wall, and it's currently sitting on the floor of the Senate, waiting for someone to pick it up after the break. But as you mentioned, the House might not be willing to wait for the Senate to find its nerves.
They definitely aren't. While the Senate was busy tabling, the House was already moving on to a different kind of math. They've been looking at a series of administrative reallocations, what people are calling the ICE escape hatch, to move existing DHS funds around. It's a bold move, and it's arguably just as controversial as the bill they just saw rejected.
It's a perfect pivot. Let's talk about how you find $5 billion in the couch cushions of the federal government. Yesterday in the Senate, we saw the formal arrival of what many on the Hill are calling the ICE escape hatch. It is Senate Bill 4277. Senator John Thune, the Republican from South Dakota, brought it to the desk late in the session. And while the title in the record is remarkably plain, simply a bill to make appropriations for U.S. immigration and customs enforcement, the legislative maneuvering behind it is where things get dense. We have mentioned the ongoing deadlock over the Department of Homeland Security budget several times over the last week. But this move represents a fundamental shift in how the Republican leadership plans to handle the impasse.
It really is a tactical pivot. Instead of trying to force the entire DHS budget through a door that has been locked for weeks, they are essentially taking the most controversial piece of the department, immigration and customs enforcement, and putting it in its own container. If you look at the specifics of the bill, which was introduced by Senator Eric Schmitt, a Republican from Missouri, the scale is what stands out. We aren't looking at a temporary fix to get them through the next few months of a shutdown. This is a $105 billion play. There is $100.36 billion for general operations and support, and another $5 billion for procurement and construction.
The duration of that funding is the detail that really highlights the strategy here. Most of these appropriations bills are yearly fights, hence the constant cycle of shutdown threats we cover. But Senator Schmitt's bill, which has co-sponsors like Senator Josh Hawley, the Republican from Missouri, and Senator Bernie Moreno, the Republican from Ohio, specifies that this money remains available until September 30th, 2036. That is a 10-year horizon. It's an attempt to take ICE funding off the table for an entire decade, insulating it from the annual budget process entirely.
It's a decade-long firewall, and the way they got it onto the calendar yesterday, Thursday, was equally telling. Senator Thune used a procedural move known as Rule 14. For those who don't spend their lives reading the Senate rulebook, Rule 14 allows a bill to bypass the committee process entirely. Usually, a bill would go to the Appropriations Committee, where it would be debated, amended, and potentially stuck in a drawer. By using Rule 14, Thune was able to skip all of that and place it directly on the Senate legislative calendar, making it available for a floor vote whenever the leadership decides to pull the trigger.
The Congressional Record from yesterday captures the moment this happened with some very specific language. Senator Thune stood up and said, "Mr. President, I understand there is a bill at the desk due a second reading." After the clerk read the title, Thune said, and I'm quoting here, "Mr. President, in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceedings." It sounds like he's blocking his own bill, but that objection is actually the key that unlocks the door to the calendar.
Exactly. It's one of those only in the Senate moments where you have to object to progress in order to make progress. By objecting to further proceedings after the second reading, he prevents the bill from being referred to a committee. The presiding officer then has to order it placed on the calendar. What this does is set up a direct dare to the Democratic caucus. By stripping out ICE and funding it through 2036 in a standalone bill, Republicans are forcing a situation where a vote against this is a vote against ICE in total, without the cover of saying you're just opposing other parts of a larger DHS bill.
That context is vital because of the deal we saw at the end of March. Remember, the Senate passed that unanimous consent agreement to keep the TSA and the Coast Guard running. Everyone agreed that we shouldn't have airport security or maritime search and rescue workers going without pay. But that deal specifically left ICE and Customs and Border Protection out in the cold. It was a partial peace treaty that left the most difficult territory for a later battle. S-4277 is that battle being joined.
It makes you wonder about the internal math for the Democrats here. If this bill comes up for a vote, they have to decide if they want to be the ones to block ICE funding during a period where border security is the dominant headline. Senator Schmitt and his colleagues are clearly betting that several moderate Democrats, especially those up for re-election in states that have seen a high volume of migrant arrivals, might find it very difficult to vote no on a clean ICE funding bill. It takes away the argument of, I like ICE, but I hate this other rider in the DHS bill.
There's also an interesting detail in the procurement side of that $5 billion. If you look at the transcripts from the hearings leading up to this, the focus hasn't just been on personnel. It's about infrastructure, detention beds, processing centers, and transport aircraft. By funding these through 2036, the bill seeks to create a permanent infrastructure for interior enforcement that can't be easily dismantled by a future administration through the simple act of withholding annual funds. It's an attempt at legislative permanence in a very volatile policy area.
It's also worth looking at the timing. Why now? The House has been pushing for aggressive reallocations, essentially telling the Senate that if they don't move on enforcement, the House will start moving money around administratively. This bill, S-4277, acts as a relief valve for that pressure. It gives the Senate Republicans something to point to and say to their House counterparts, we are trying to fund the enforcement side. Look at the calendar.
And the record shows that Senator Thune is moving fast. The bill was introduced on March 27th, and by yesterday, Thursday, it was already through its second reading and on the calendar. That is warp speed for the Senate. Usually, a bill of this magnitude would take months to even get a hearing. This has moved from introduction to being vote-ready in less than a week. It shows a level of coordination among Republican leadership that we haven't always seen during this session.
Do you think there's a risk for them here, though? By separating ICE, are they accidentally making it easier for the rest of the DHS budget to remain unfunded? If you solve the ICE problem for the next 10 years, does the urgency to fund the rest of the Department of Homeland Security, things like cybersecurity, FEMA, or the Secret Service, start to evaporate? It's a gamble that enforcement is the only thing the public really cares about in that department.
That's a point several analysts have raised. If you take the hostage, so to speak, out of the negotiation, what is left to negotiate with? For months, ICE funding has been the primary leverage point. If Republicans get this through, they lose that leverage over other policy priorities. However, the transcript from the floor suggests they are more concerned with the immediate operational crisis. There have been reports of ICE having to scale back deportation flights because they simply ran out of the specific operations and support money that this bill targets.
You can see that reflected in the $100.36 billion figure. That is a massive sum for operations. To put it in perspective, that's more than the entire annual budget for many other cabinet-level departments. It suggests they aren't just looking to maintain the status quo. They are looking to significantly expand the capacity for interior enforcement. If that money is locked in through 2036, it fundamentally changes the trajectory of immigration policy in this country for a generation, regardless of who sits in the White House.
I was looking back at the last time we saw a Rule 14 used this aggressively. It usually happens when the minority party wants to force a difficult vote. But here we have the majority leader, or in this case, the Republican leadership, using it to bypass their own committee chairs. It suggests that even within the Republican caucus, there might be some disagreement on the specifics of this $105 billion. Senator Thune might be trying to prevent a committee-level fight between the fiscal hawks and the security hawks.
That is a great point. The fiscal hawks, especially those aligned with the newer cost-cutting initiatives we have seen in the House, might look at a 10-year, $105 billion appropriation and see a lack of accountability. They usually want to keep these agencies on a short leash with annual reviews. But the security hawks want the certainty. They want to know that an ICE agent in 2032 won't be worried about a government shutdown affecting their ability to do a job. By using Rule 14, Thune effectively mutes that internal debate and presents a unified front.
The language of the bill itself is also very focused. It specifies that these funds are for the enforcement of existing immigration laws. That might seem redundant. What else would they use it for? But it's a direct response to the criticism that recent administrations have used ICE funding for alternatives to detention, or processing programs rather than removals. This bill is written to be a very narrow, very sharp tool for enforcement only.
And the Democratic response yesterday was relatively quiet on the floor. But the silence shouldn't be mistaken for agreement. There's a tactical reason for them to wait. If they object too loudly now, they play into the Republican narrative that they are anti-enforcement. But if they let it sit on the calendar, they can wait for the broader DHS funding deadline to approach and try to wrap this back into a larger package. The problem is, Thune has already separated the two. You can't easily put the toothpaste back in the tube once it's a standalone bill on the calendar.
It's also a matter of what happens next with the rest of the agency. We still have Customs and Border Protection, the actual Border Patrol agents at the line, who are not covered by this bill. S4277 is purely for ICE, the Interior Agency. So even if this passes, the broken border argument doesn't go away, because the Border Patrol is still operating on fumes from that partial deal in March. It's a very specific escape hatch. It doesn't lead to a total solution for the department.
It really highlights the fragmented nature of Congress right now. We are no longer seeing these big, comprehensive solutions. We are seeing these mini-bills or targeted vehicles. First it was the TSA and the Coast Guard, now it's ICE. It's like they are trying to rebuild the federal government one brick at a time, because they can't agree on the blueprint for the whole house. But each brick comes with its own 10-year price tag and its own set of rules.
One more detail from the record that caught my eye: the mention of transportation of unaccompanied minors and removal operations. The bill specifically carves out portions of that $5 billion for the physical infrastructure of removal. This isn't just about salaries. It's about buses, planes, and detention centers. When you fund that through 2036, you are essentially making a long-term investment in a specific type of immigration infrastructure. It's a move that says, this is the policy of the United States for the next decade. Period.
And that brings us back to the reality of the calendar. By placing this on the legislative schedule yesterday, Senator Thune has ensured that when they return from the break, this will be one of the first things they can bring to a vote. It's a looming presence. As the country watches the DHS funding clock tick down, this bill will be sitting right there, a fully funded enforcement machine, ready for a yes or no vote.
It certainly sets the stage for a very high-stakes April. But as the Senate tries to find this escape hatch for ICE, they are still haunted by the broader failure to fund the rest of the government. In fact, the very move to separate these agencies is a reminder of how deep the divisions really are. It's a strategy born of necessity, but it leaves a lot of other essential services in a very precarious position.
And that precariousness is something we need to look at more closely, because while ICE might have its escape hatch, the rest of the department is still wandering the halls of a 42-day shutdown that won't seem to end. The ghost of that shutdown is starting to affect things that most people wouldn't even associate with the border.
That image of the escape hatch for ICE is a useful way to frame the strategy. But while that specific agency is being treated as a separate entity, the rest of the Department of Homeland Security is still grappling with the fallout of that 42-day shutdown. The record from yesterday, Thursday, April 2nd, shows that the House is officially moving the chess pieces over to the Senate. At 7:02 a.m., which is quite early, even by Capitol standards, Mr. McLaughlin, a House reading clerk, made the trip across the building to deliver a message to the Senate. The timing of a delivery like that usually signals a desire to get the legislative clock started as soon as the sun comes up. It's a way of saying, the House has finished its part. The pressure is now entirely on you.
And what Mr. McLaughlin delivered wasn't a single document. It was a package of bills that illustrates exactly where the House and Senate are still grinding gears. The most significant piece here is H.R. 8029, which is the full-year appropriations for DHS for the 2026 fiscal year. But tucked in there with it was H.R. 7084, a bill dealing with maritime regulations and vessel cargo transfers in navigable waters. It might look like a random maritime update, but when you look at the broader context of the Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, which falls under DHS, has been one of the agencies caught in the crossfire of this shutdown. They were part of that temporary reprieve in late March, but their long-term funding is still tied to these larger arguments over cargo, ports, and who gets to enter American waters.
The transcript captures the moment quite formally. It reads, "Message from the House. At 7:02 a.m., a message from the House of Representatives, delivered by Mr. McLaughlin, one of its reading clerks, announced that the House has passed the following bills, in which it requests the concurrence of the Senate. H.R. 7084, an act to amend Title 46, United States Code, with respect to the types of vessels that may enter or operate in navigable waters of the United States, or transfer cargo in any port or place under the jurisdiction of the United States, and for other purposes. H.R. 8029, an act making appropriations for the Department of Homeland Security for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2026, and for other purposes." That sounds like routine business, but after 42 days of a partial shutdown, routine is a heavy word. Most people forget that while the Senate passed that measure in late March to restore funding for TSA, FEMA, and the Coast Guard, they did that through a very specific, limited agreement. It didn't solve the core dispute. It just stopped the bleeding for the agencies that the public interacts with most directly.
Right. It was essentially a PR-friendly Band-Aid. Nobody wanted to see TSA agents working without pay for a second month, and the threat of FEMA running dry during spring storm season was a political nightmare. So, the Senate found a way to fund those essential services. But by doing that, they created this strange, bifurcated reality where the Coast Guard and TSA are back on the payroll, while the funding for ICE and Border Patrol remains the central battleground. This latest House message shows that House Republicans are refusing to accept that split. By sending over H.R. 8029, the full DHS package, they are forcing the Senate to confront the ICE and Border Patrol funding again. It's a rejection of the Senate's save the popular agencies, skip the controversial ones.
You can see the tension in the House vote that sent this over. It passed 220 to 207. That is a tight margin that falls almost entirely along party lines. Republican leadership, including the Speaker, a Republican from Louisiana, has been framing this as America First spending. They argue that you cannot claim to fund Homeland Security if you are leaving the agencies responsible for the border out in the cold. On the other side, you have members like the representative from Connecticut, a Democrat, who argue that the House version of the DHS bill is loaded with policy riders that have nothing to do with security and everything to do with social policy. So, the House passes all 12 appropriations bills, hands them over, and says, "We did our job. If the shutdown resumes, or these agencies remain in limbo, it's a Senate problem now."
I think there's a deeper institutional friction here that people miss. In late March, when that temporary agreement was reached, it was a unanimous consent move in the Senate. That requires everyone to play nice. But that spirit of cooperation was very narrow. It only applied to TSA, FEMA, and the Coast Guard. The House leadership felt that the Senate was essentially cherry-picking the easy parts of government to fund so they could ignore the hard parts. By sending H.R. 8029 over yesterday, the House is effectively trying to reunify the department. They want the Senate to have to vote on the whole thing: ICE, Border Patrol, and the body cameras and de-escalation training that Democrats have been pushing for since January.
It's also worth looking at what was excluded from that earlier peace treaty in March. Senate Democrats have been very vocal about their refusal to fund certain parts of the ICE infrastructure without increased oversight. They've pointed to the House's January bill, which actually had some bipartisan support because it included funding for the Office of the Inspector General and new oversight mechanisms. But the version that moved yesterday, H.R. 8029, shifts the focus back toward enforcement and physical infrastructure. It's a very different animal than the bipartisan overtures we saw at the start of the year. It feels like the 42 days of the shutdown actually hardened the positions rather than encouraging a middle ground. Each side spent those 6 weeks building a case to their base, and now they're bringing those solidified cases back to the floor.
Exactly. The ghost of the shutdown isn't just about the money. It's about the trust that was burned. When the Senate Democrats blocked the full-year funding in February, it triggered the lapse. Then you had 42 days of finger-pointing. Now the House has finished all 12 bills. That's a significant milestone for them. They can technically say they've fulfilled their constitutional duty. But the Senate hasn't taken up the DHS package because they know it doesn't have 60 votes. So we're in this loop, The House sends a bill that won't pass the Senate. The Senate sends back a partial fix that the House doesn't like. And in the middle of all this, you have the actual employees. The Coast Guard is funded for now, but for how long? The House message also mentioned H.R. 7147, which is a consolidated appropriations bill. The House basically said they agree with the Senate's amendment to that bill, but they added their own amendment on top of it. It's the legislative version of having the last word in an argument.
The Maritime Bill, H.R. 7084, is a perfect example of how these larger fights swallow up smaller, necessary adjustments. Title 46 of the United States Code is the backbone of how we regulate who can bring a ship into an American port. It's technical, it's dry, and in any other year, it might pass by a voice vote without a single headline. But because it's a vessel operation bill, and the Coast Guard is the agency that enforces those rules, it gets pulled into the DHS gravity well. If you're a port authority in Savannah or Long Beach, you're looking at this House message and wondering if the rules for your cargo transfers are going to be held hostage by a debate over border wall funding. The record shows the House wants the Senate to concur, but concurrence requires a level of agreement that hasn't existed on the Hill for months.
It's like a surgical team that only numbs the left half of a patient before starting the operation. The government is functioning because the airports are open and FEMA is responding to disasters. But the internal organs of the DHS, the administrative side, the long-term planning, the tech upgrades, are essentially paralyzed. The House Republicans are using these early morning deliveries to signal that they won't let the Senate keep the patient partially numbed. They want the whole department funded under their terms. Or they want the Senate to be the ones who explain why the funding runs out again in April. It's a high-stakes game of who blinks first, and the 7:02 a.m. arrival of Mr. McLaughlin is a sign that the House is already wide awake and ready to push.
And we should mention that the 220 to 207 vote on the House side shows that the Republican caucus is holding together on this America First priority. They've managed to keep their most conservative members and their moderates in the same camp by tying the border funding to the broader DHS package. For a Republican from a swing district, it's hard to vote against a bill that funds the Coast Guard and TSA. For a Democrat, it's hard to vote for a bill that they feel overfunds detention centers. This House message is essentially a dare. It's saying to the Senate, we gave you everything. We gave you the maritime rules, we gave you the TSA money, we gave you the FEMA money. All you have to do is accept the ICE money that comes with it.
But the Senate is unlikely to take that dare. The Democratic majority there, led by the senator from New York, has already indicated that they won't move on H.R. 8029 in its current form. They're looking for a version that includes those body cameras and de-escalation training elements that were in the January bipartisan draft. So while the House says we finished our duty, the Senate sees it as the House sending over a bill they know is dead on arrival. It's a fascinating disconnect in what doing your job looks like. To the House, it's passing the bill. To the Senate, it's passing a bill that can actually become law. And until those two definitions align, the ghost of this 42-day shutdown is going to keep haunting the halls of the Capitol.
The reality for the agencies is that they are living month to month. Even with the reprieve, the planning cycles for something as large as the Department of Homeland Security are completely broken. You can't sign a 5-year contract for new screening technology or maritime patrol aircraft if your budget is being delivered in 7 a.m. installments that the other chamber refuses to read. That maritime bill, H.R. 7084, specifically mentions cargo transfers in any port or place under the jurisdiction of the United States. That affects the global supply chain. When those rules are in limbo, because they're attached to a broader DHS fight, the ripple effects go far beyond the Beltway. It affects the cost of goods and the security of our coastlines in ways that don't always make it into the 1-minute floor speeches.
It really highlights the difference between a functional government and a funded government. We might have the lights on, but the engine is stalling. And as we move deeper into April, that tension is only going to mount. The Senate has the bills now. They can't say they're waiting on the House anymore. The ball is in their court, and how they handle these specific House messages will determine if we're heading for another lapse or if a compromise is actually possible. But as we saw later in the day yesterday, not everyone in the Senate is interested in a quiet compromise. In fact, some members are already lining up to challenge the very framework of how these negotiations are happening.
That's a perfect bridge to what happened later on the Senate floor. Because while the leadership is focused on these big budget buckets and maritime rules, individual senators are using the proceedings to voice some very sharp dissents. One in particular really stood out for how it challenged the consensus on both sides of the aisle. It takes the conversation from the macro level of department funding down to the micro level of how these laws actually impact the people they're supposed to protect. And that brings us to the senator from Missouri, and what some are calling a fundamental break from the party line. The Senate floor yesterday, Thursday, afternoon saw a return to some very specific individual stances that might have been buried during the broader headlines of the funding debate. One in particular came from Josh Hawley, the Republican from Missouri. He made a point to get his position into the official Congressional Record, even though there wasn't a formal roll call vote at the moment he was addressing. It's a move that provides a look into the internal friction within the Republican caucus regarding how the Department of Homeland Security should be funded, and, perhaps more importantly, what it should be allowed to spend that money on.
It's one of those moments that highlights the difference between voting for the idea of something and voting for the actual document on the table. The record from April 2nd shows that Senator Hawley submitted a vote explanation for the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act for 2026. This was H.R. 7147. He was very clear about where he stood on the amended version of this bill and the procedural maneuvers surrounding it. It wasn't a standard aye from a member of the party that usually pushes for more border security funding. He was effectively putting up a red flag.
The transcript captures it quite clearly. The record says, Mr. President, had there been a recorded vote on calendar number 311, H.R. 7147, Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act 2026, as amended, I would have voted nay. In addition, had there been a recorded vote on tabling the House message to accompany H.R. 7147, I would have voted nay. That is a double nay on a bill that is central to the current security debate. It is a specific choice to ensure the history books show he was against the consensus version of this funding.
Wait, let's look at that second part. He would have voted nay on tabling the House message. For those who don't spend their lives reading the Senate rulebook, tabling a message is essentially a way for the Senate leadership to kill a proposal from the House without having to debate it in full. It's a procedural delete button. By saying he would have voted against tabling it, the senator from Missouri is indicating he wanted that House version, which was likely more restrictive or included different enforcement priorities, to stay alive for debate. He was siding with the House Republicans' original vision over the Senate's negotiated compromise.
That nuance is important because it gets to the heart of the divide. The Senate version of H.R. 7147, as amended, is the product of that fragile bipartisan group we've been tracking. But for Senator Hawley, the issue isn't the amount of money being spent on the border. It's the fine print of the department's other activities. If you look at his legislative history, he's been very vocal about something he calls the Ending DHS Funding for Liberal Propaganda Act. He has expressed concern that the department is using taxpayer dollars for grants that fund media literacy programs. In his view, these programs are essentially targeting conservative viewpoints under the guise of fighting misinformation.
Right. And he actually detailed this in a letter to the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. He pointed to grants given to academic institutions that he claims were used to develop tools for flagging problematic speech on social media. So, when he looks at a massive appropriations bill like H.R. 7147, he's not seeing a bill that funds Border Patrol agents. He's seeing a bill that continues to fund these grant programs he finds ideologically biased. It creates a difficult position for a Republican. You want the border funded, you want the Coast Guard funded, but you don't want to sign a check for the specific offices within the DHS that you believe are working against your constituents.
And this is where he runs into friction with some of his colleagues. Many other Republicans argue that you have to take the win on the border funding and the ICE detention beds, even if the bill contains things you dislike. But Hawley's stance yesterday suggests he believes the poison pills, as he perceives them, are too significant to ignore. It's a refusal to accept the lesser of two evils framing that usually drives these large-scale spending bills. The transcript shows he's willing to be the lone nay, or part of a very small group of nays, to maintain that consistency.
It's also worth considering the timing. We are in the middle of a primary season for many of these members. Putting a nay on the record for a DHS bill that was negotiated with Senate Democrats can be a very effective way to signal to the base that you aren't part of the Washington establishment that cuts deals. Even if he knows the bill will pass, having that nay in the Congressional Record allows him to say to voters in Missouri, "I didn't vote to fund the agency that's monitoring your social media posts." It's a very specific brand of legislative accountability.
The vote explanation itself is a fascinating institutional tool. In the Senate, if a vote is conducted by voice, where everyone just shouts aye or no and the chair decides who was louder, there's no individual record of how you voted. Or, if a senator is tied up in a committee hearing and misses a roll call, they can use this statement for the record to clarify their position. It ensures that when future researchers look back at the 119th Congress, they don't see a unanimous voice vote. They see that the Republican from Missouri was a formal dissenter.
But let's look at the risk he's taking. Back in January, during a press gaggle, he was asked about the risk of a shutdown. He said then that he wouldn't support defunding critical law enforcement like the TSA or the military pay that comes out of the DHS budget. So by voting nay yesterday, he is essentially gambling that the bill will pass anyway. He wants the benefits of the funding, the security, and the paychecks for agents, while simultaneously maintaining the purity of his opposition to the department's leadership. It's a tightrope walk. If everyone followed his lead and voted nay, the very agencies he claims to support would run out of money.
That is the ultimate paradox of the modern appropriations process. You see it on both sides. Members will vote against a final bill because of a specific provision, while privately hoping the bill passes so their district doesn't lose federal services. But Hawley's focus on media literacy grants adds a layer of modern cultural conflict to what used to be a fairly straightforward debate about border agents and equipment. He's looking at the DHS through the lens of a domestic ideological battle, rather than just a national security one.
And he's not entirely alone in that shift. While he's the one who put the statement in the record yesterday, other members of the House Freedom Caucus have been pushing for similar restrictions. They want to dismantle the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, which is part of the DHS. They view CISA's work on election security and misinformation as a form of government-sponsored censorship. So when Hawley votes nay on the Senate side, he's providing a bridge to those House members who feel the same way. He's saying, the Senate isn't a monolith on this. There is support for your harder line over here.
It really changes the math for the leadership. If you're the senator from New York, Chuck Schumer, or the senator from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell, and you're trying to find a version of this bill that can get 60 votes, you have to decide if you want to court people like Hawley by removing those controversial grant programs, or if you just ignore them and find the votes elsewhere. Yesterday's record indicates that for now, they've decided to move forward without him. But as we see more of these vote explanations pop up, that 60-vote threshold starts to look a lot more precarious.
It also signals that the reprieve we talked about earlier, this temporary funding that has the lights on, isn't actually solving the underlying dispute. We're just kicking the ideological fight down the road. Hawley's nay is a promise that when the next full-year funding bill comes up, he's going to be looking for those same grant programs. He's setting the stage for a much larger battle over the very mission of the Department of Homeland Security. Does it exist to protect the physical borders, or does it have a role in the digital border of information? That's the question he's forcing onto the floor.
It's a question that the Senate hasn't fully answered. For decades, the DHS was the one department that almost always got a bipartisan yes, because no one wanted to be seen as weak on security. That era seems to be officially over. When you have a member as prominent as the Republican from Missouri putting a formal dissent in the record over media literacy, it shows that the department is now subject to the same partisan scrutiny as the Department of Education or the EPA. It's no longer a sacred cow.
And that scrutiny is going to be front and center as the Senate moves towards some procedural hurdles in the coming days. Specifically, how they handle bills that have already passed the House but are being held up by individual objections. It's a perfect segue into one of the more technical but incredibly powerful tools being used right now to bypass this kind of individual dissent. We're moving from the why of the vote to the how of the schedule.
Exactly. Because while a vote explanation is a powerful way to make a point, it doesn't actually stop the train. To do that, you need a different set of rules. And that brings us to a process that has been getting a lot of use lately. One that usually stays in the shadows, but is currently defining the Senate's pace. We're talking about Rule 14, and the way it's being used to jump the line. The Senate floor can be a place of strange contradictions if you're watching the procedural gears turn. Yesterday, Thursday, we saw a perfect example of this, with Senator John Thune, the Republican from South Dakota. To a casual observer, it might have looked like he was suffering from a bit of legislative indecision, or perhaps arguing with himself. He stood up, asked for a bill to be read for a second time, and then immediately blocked it from moving forward.
It's one of those moments where the logic of the Senate seems to invert. You'd think if someone wants a bill to progress, they wouldn't be the one shouting objection the second the clerk finishes reading the title. But in this case, the objection was the entire point. It's the mechanical key that unlocks a very specific door in the Senate rulebook, specifically Rule 14. If you look at the record from yesterday, this wasn't about stopping a bill, it was about fast-tracking it.
Exactly. The bill in question is S-4277, introduced by Senator Eric Schmitt, the Republican from Missouri. It's a massive appropriations bill, specifically for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Now, under normal circumstances, a bill is introduced, read once, read a second time on a different legislative day, and then referred to a committee. In this instance, that would likely be the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs.
And that's where the political math comes in. That committee is currently chaired by a Democrat. If you're Senator Schmitt or Senator Thune acting on behalf of the Republican leadership, you might look at that committee and see a graveyard for a bill that provides over $100 billion for ICE enforcement. Rule 14 allows you to bypass that committee entirely. By objecting to his own request for further proceedings, Thune ensured the bill skipped the committee phase and landed directly on the Senate legislative calendar.
The transcript of the exchange is brief, but it carries a lot of weight. Thune said, and I'm quoting the record here, "Mr. President, I understand there is a bill at the desk due a second reading." Then, after the clerk read the title, Thune followed up with, "Mr. President, in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 814, I would object to further proceedings." It's a scripted dance. The presiding officer then had to state, "Objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar under Rule 814.
It sounds like a minor administrative hurdle, but think about what it changes. If this bill had gone to committee, the chair could have sat on it for months. They could have held hearings that the sponsors didn't want, or amended it until it was unrecognizable. By using Rule 14, the bill is now available for floor consideration. It's sitting there on the calendar, essentially a loaded spring. Any senator could, in theory, move to proceed to it, though in practice, that's usually a leadership call.
And the substance of S-4277 is what makes this maneuver so significant right now. This isn't just a routine funding patch. Senator Schmitt, along with co-sponsors like Senator Josh Hawley, the Republican from Missouri, and Senator Bernie Moreno, the Republican from Ohio, are pushing for a total of $100,360 million for ICE operations and support. But here is the detail that really shifts the landscape. Those funds are designated as available through September 30th, 2036.
Wait, let's pause on that. 2036? We're in April of 2026. This isn't an annual budget. This is a 10-year funding commitment for immigration enforcement. In a town that usually struggles to keep the lights on for more than 3 weeks at a time, a 10-year appropriation is practically an eternity.
It is. And it's a direct response to what happened earlier this week. If you remember, the Senate passed a funding bill for the Department of Homeland Security that many Republicans felt left out the teeth of the agency. The enforcement and removal operations handled by ICE and the border patrolling handled by CBP. By introducing S4277 as a standalone 10-year funding bill, Schmidt is trying to insulate ICE from the annual shutdown theater we've been seeing.
It's a security wall made of money rather than steel. By putting it on the calendar under Rule 14, they are signaling that they aren't interested in negotiating the specifics in a committee room. They want the full Senate to have to look at this number, that $100 billion, and vote on it. It puts the majority leader in a position where they have to decide whether to ignore a bill that is ready for the floor or allow a debate that will inevitably focus on border numbers.
There's also $5 billion in there for procurement, construction, and improvements, also available until 2036. The language in the bill specifically emphasizes the enforcement of existing immigration laws. It's a very pointed jab at the current administration's enforcement priorities. The idea is to lock in the funding so that even if the political winds shift, the resources for deportations and detentions are legally obligated for a decade.
I wonder about the precedent here, though. If you use Rule 14 for a 10-year funding bill today, what stops the other side from using it for a 10-year climate fund or a 10-year education grant tomorrow? The Senate usually relies on the committee process to vet these long-term commitments. When you bypass that, you're essentially saying the committee's expertise or its ability to provide a bipartisan filter is no longer a priority, or worse, that it's an obstacle.
That's a fair pushback. From an institutional perspective, the committees are where the fine print gets read. When a bill goes straight to the calendar, the first time most senators might really engage with the text is when a motion to proceed is filed. It prioritizes speed and political messaging over the slow cooker approach the Senate was designed for. But the sponsors would argue that the slow cooker has been broken for years, and Rule 14 is just a way to keep the stove on.
It's also a way to force a public display. If you're the Republican from South Dakota and you're acting as the floor leader, you're putting your colleagues on the other side of the aisle in a bind. If they block the bill from coming up for a vote, you can say they are blocking ICE funding. If they allow it to come up, you get a week-long debate on immigration enforcement during an election cycle. It's a tactical win either way for the GOP, which is why the Rule 14 maneuver is so attractive.
Let's look at the actual text of Rule 14 for a second, because there's a common misconception that this skipping is a loophole. It's actually a very formal part of the standing rules of the Senate. Paragraph 4 states that if there's an objection to further proceeding after the second reading, the bill shall be placed on the calendar. It's a right every senator technically has, though it's almost always exercised by a member of leadership or the bill's primary sponsor.
And the further proceedings that Thune objected to include things like referring the bill to the Committee of Jurisdiction. It's essentially a keep-it-at-the-desk move. Once it's at the desk and then on the calendar, it's in a state of legislative limbo, but it's a high-level limbo. It's no longer a new bill, it's an active one. It has a number, it has a place on the schedule, and it's ready to be called up at a moment's notice.
It's worth noting the timing. This happened on Thursday, right as the Senate was looking toward a series of other funding deadlines. By dropping a 10-year ICE bill now, Senator Schmidt is effectively changing the conversation from how do we fund the government for the next 6 months to how do we fund immigration enforcement for the next decade. It shifts the goalposts significantly.
I'm looking at the co-sponsors again. You mentioned Hawley and Moreno. These are members who have been very vocal about what they call administrative erasure. The idea that the executive branch is using its budget authority to effectively stop enforcing laws they don't like. This bill, by providing that $100 billion with such a long expiration date, is an attempt to take that discretion away from future administrations as well.
And that's the part that most people don't realize when they see these procedural blurbs in the record. It's not just a bill about ICE. It's a bill that tries to bind the hands of the executive branch for the next 2.5 presidential terms. If this were to pass, a future president couldn't simply say, "We don't have the budget for these removals." The money is there. It's appropriated. It's on the books for 2028, 2032, and beyond.
It really highlights the shift in how the Senate is functioning. We've talked before about how the regular order, the idea of bills going to committee, being marked up, and coming to the floor with a bipartisan report, is becoming the exception rather than the rule. Rule 14 is the escape hatch. But when you use the escape hatch for every major piece of legislation, the hatch eventually becomes the main entrance.
The transcript from yesterday shows that the whole process took less than 2 minutes. The clerk reads the title, "A Bill S-4277 to make appropriations for U.S. immigration and customs enforcement." Thune says his lines. The presiding officer says their lines. And just like that, $100 billion in potential spending moves from a piece of paper to a live item on the Senate's to-do list. There was no debate, no speeches, just the quiet clicking of the procedural clock.
But that silence is deceptive. Behind that 2-minute exchange is weeks of coordination. You have to ensure that the bill is drafted in a way that qualifies for Rule 14. You have to coordinate with the parliamentarian to ensure the second reading happens on the correct legislative day. You have to make sure your members are ready if the other side tries to countermove. It's a high-stakes game of chess, and Thune just moved a very powerful piece into the center of the board.
It also sets up a fascinating dynamic for the next few weeks. If the Senate moves toward a broader discussion on border security, this bill is now the baseline for the Republican position. They can point to it and say, "We have a plan. It's right there on the calendar. Why won't you vote on it?" It's a way of reclaiming the narrative by using the very rules that are supposed to keep the Senate orderly.
I think it's interesting to compare this to how the House handles things. In the House, the Rules Committee just decides how a bill will be debated. In the Senate, because there is no Rules Committee for individual bills in the same way, you have to find these leverage points. Rule 14 is one of the few ways a minority, or even a majority that doesn't want to deal with a specific committee, can force the issue.
And the choice of Senator Thune to do it is also telling. As the Republican from South Dakota, he's a key part of the leadership team. When he stands up to do this, it's not a fringe move. It's the party's official position. They are signaling that ICE funding is a standalone priority that they are willing to use every procedural trick to protect.
It also complicates the life of the committee chairs. If I'm the chair of the Homeland Security Committee, and a bill that falls squarely in my jurisdiction just bypassed me, I'm looking at a loss of power. The committee system is built on the idea that experts, senators who spend years focusing on one topic, get the first look. Rule 14 says, we don't need the first look. We're ready for the final look.
It's a tension that has been growing for years. The more polarized the committees become, the more the floor becomes the only place where anything can actually happen. But the floor is also the most crowded place in Washington. By adding S-4277 to the calendar, the Republicans had added one more weight to an already overloaded schedule.
And let's not forget the 2036 aspect again. That date isn't an accident. It's a 10-year window. 10 years is the standard budget window that the Congressional Budget Office uses to score bills. By making the funding last exactly 10 years, the sponsors are ensuring that the score for this bill, the total cost, is captured in a way that fits into the broader budget debates we're going to see later this summer.
It's a very sophisticated way of playing the long game while using the short-term rules of the Senate. You take a procedural rule that was designed for efficiency, and you use it to park a massive decade-long policy shift right on the majority leader's doorstep.
Which brings us to what happens next. The bill is on the calendar. It's Rule 14'd. Now we wait to see if the Republican from Missouri or any of his colleagues will try to move to proceed to it. In the Senate, being on the calendar is like having a ticket to the theater. It doesn't mean you're on stage yet, but you're in the building, and you're holding a seat that someone else might want.
The procedural dance we saw yesterday isn't just about one bill for ICE. It's about a broader strategy of unbundling the government. Instead of one giant bill that funds everything, we're seeing these attempts to carve out specific, high-priority agencies and give them long-term certainty. It's a fundamental challenge to how the power of the purse has been exercised for the last 50 years.
It's also a challenge to the idea of oversight. If a committee doesn't get to review the bill, they don't get to ask the ICE director why they need $5 billion for improvements as opposed to $4 billion. They don't get to drill down into the operations and support line items. You're asking the Senate to take a $100 billion leap of faith based on a bill that appeared at the desk and jumped the line.
And yet, in a Senate where committees are often deadlocked, many would argue this is the only way to get anything done. It's the ultimate break glass in case of emergency rule. The fact that it's being used for a 10-year funding bill shows just how high the stakes have become. We're moving away from the era of the annual check-in and into the era of the decadal lock-in.
It's a mastery of the rules that would make a parliamentarian blush. It's clean, it's fast, and it's completely legal under the rules. But the downstream effects on how the Senate handles its business are going to be felt long after the current debate over S-4277 is over.
Exactly, because once you show that the committee process is optional for a $100 billion bill, it's hard to argue it's mandatory for anything else. It changes the gravity of the whole institution.
And that sense of changing gravity, of experimenting with how the rules can be pushed to their absolute limit, isn't just happening with funding. It's happening with how the Senate handles the very concept of its own authority, which is a perfect way to look at another development from the record, something that's been described as a mastery experiment in legislative control.
The idea of mastery, of actually proving you know a concept before moving on, is fundamentally at odds with how the American education system has functioned for over a century. Yesterday, Thursday, April 2nd, Representative Lloyd Smucker, a Republican from Pennsylvania, highlighted a small elementary school in his district that's trying to break that century-old mold. Wrightsville Elementary, which sits in the Eastern York School District, was recently recognized as a Pennsylvania Blue Ribbon school. But it's the specific reason for that recognition that caught my attention in the record. They were named an exemplary achievement gap closing school. In a K-5 environment with only about 350 students, they're implementing something called mastery badging, and the transcript of Smucker's remarks suggests this is more than just a local success story. It's being framed as a potential roadmap for addressing the learning loss we've seen nationwide over the last few years.
The mastery badging phrase is what stands out to me because it directly challenges the Carnegie unit. If you look at the history of American schooling, we've been obsessed with seat time since 1906. That was the year the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching decided that a unit of education was essentially 120 hours of contact time with an instructor. We've been measuring learning by the clock for over 100 years. If a student sits in a chair for the required hours, they move to the next grade, regardless of whether they actually understood the material or if they were bored because they mastered it in the first week. What Smucker is describing at Wrightsville is a move toward a competency-based model. You don't move on because the calendar says it's June. You move on because you earned the badge for that specific skill.
It's a massive shift in gravity for a public school. The record notes that Wrightsville is a student-centered model designed to prepare kids for evolving global challenges. To get that blue ribbon status from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a school has to show they are significantly reducing disparities between different student subgroups. Smucker emphasized that this badging system is the engine behind that progress. In the transcript, he says, a key feature of this personalized learning model is Wrightsville's mastery badging system, which tracks progress based on a student's skills rather than time spent, promoting engagement and ownership during their learning. That word, ownership, is the one that Hill staffers often circle in these education briefings. It implies that a 7-year-old is suddenly responsible for their own data.
I'm curious about the logistics of that, though. When you look at Smucker's district, you're talking about a mix of suburban and more rural communities. Implementing a system where 350 kids are all potentially on different tracks or at different levels of badge completion sounds like a nightmare for a traditional teacher. In a standard classroom, you teach to the middle. You hope the kids at the top don't get too bored, and the kids at the bottom don't fall too far behind. But if you're using a digital badging system to track individual mastery, the teacher's role shifts from a lecturer to something more like a flight controller. The record doesn't go into the software specifics, but it mentions the school identifies unique learning needs for every student. That suggests a level of data tracking that most schools simply aren't equipped for yet.
The transcript actually touches on that transition. Smucker commended the teachers and administration specifically for fostering this environment. It requires a high level of trust. If you think about the traditional A through F grading scale, it's a very blunt instrument. An A might mean you mastered the material, or it might mean you're good at taking tests. A C might mean you're struggling with the core concept, or it might just mean you forgot to turn in 3 homework assignments. Mastery badging, as described in the record, aims to strip away that noise. You either have the skill or you don't. If you don't, you keep working on it. There's no failing and moving on to the next chapter anyway, which is how we end up with high schoolers who struggle with middle school math. They didn't fail the grade, but they never earned the mastery badges for the foundations.
There's a debate to be had here about the social aspect of this, though. If we move away from seat time, do we lose the cohort model? One of the arguments for the traditional system is that kids learn to work with their peers who are at the same developmental stage. If one child is 3 badges ahead in math, but 2 badges behind in reading, their school day looks very different from their neighbors. Smucker is presenting this as an innovative approach to ensure that all students are given every chance to succeed. That's a powerful line in the Congressional Record, but the skeptics usually point to the fact that personalized learning can sometimes lead to isolated learning if it's just a kid staring at a screen earning digital tokens. However, the blue ribbon for closing the gap suggests that whatever Wrightsville is doing, it's keeping those students from falling through the cracks.
The record indicates the school is still very much a community. Smucker mentioned the collective efforts of the student body and the administration together. This isn't just an individual quest for badges, it's a structural change in how the school identifies success. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania doesn't hand out blue ribbons lightly. They look at multi-year data. To be an exemplary achievement gap-closing school in 2026, you had to navigate the residual effects of the disruptions from the early 2020s. We know from national data that the gap between high-performing and low-performing students widened significantly during that period. For Wrightsville to be closing those gaps now suggests that the mastery badging system might be providing a safety net. If a student misses a week or struggles with a specific concept, the system knows exactly where they stopped. They aren't just pushed into the next lesson because it's Tuesday.
It's also a play for engagement, which Smucker mentioned. When a student can see their progress in real time, like a video game level or a scout sash, it changes the psychology of the classroom. Instead of waiting for a report card every 9 weeks to see how they're doing, they have that constant feedback loop. It's a move toward transparency for the parents, too. Imagine knowing exactly which 3 skills your child is working on this week, rather than just knowing they have a B in social studies. Smucker's praise for the Eastern York School District seems to be a signal to his colleagues that the factory model of education isn't the only way forward. He's putting a stake in the ground for his district as a leader in this mastery philosophy.
And that leadership is exactly what he wanted on the record. He concluded his remarks by saying, "Eastern York's commitment to the next generation is clear, and I am proud to have such a place for students in my district." It's a classic floor speech in many ways, honoring a local achievement, but the focus on the mechanics of the mastery badge gives it a different weight. We're seeing more members of Congress dive into these pedagogical debates as federal funding for education recovery remains a hot topic. If a 350-student school in Wrightsville, Pennsylvania can close achievement gaps using a skill-based model, you can bet that committees are going to start asking why larger districts aren't doing the same.
It's a question of whether you can scale that Wrightsville magic to a district with 30,000 students. But for now, the record shows one small win for a model that prioritizes what a student knows over how long they've been sitting in a desk. It's an experiment in mastery that seems to be paying off in Eastern York. But while Smucker was focused on the future of the American workforce in Pennsylvania, other members were looking much further afield, to the actual fuel that keeps the global economy moving.
That takes us from the classrooms of Wrightsville to the shipping lanes of the Persian Gulf. Because as much as we talk about the new economy and digital badges, the old economy of oil and energy is currently dominating the debate on the other side of the Capitol. Let's look at what the record says about the fuelers of the Middle East. Yesterday, Thursday, April 2nd, the House floor saw a moment that felt both very local and intensely global. Representative Pablo José Hernandez, the Democrat from Puerto Rico, rose to recognize the homecoming of the 204th Transportation Company. This is a unit within the 1st Mission Support Command, and they were returning to the island after a deployment to the Middle East. It's the kind of speech that happens often, but the details in the record tell a much larger story about the logistics of modern conflict.
Since we have a bit more room to breathe in this edition, I want to really look at the logistics of what these soldiers were doing. Hernandez specifically called them fuelers. That's a term that gets tossed around, but in the context of a Middle East deployment, it's a grueling assignment. You're talking about the 204th ensuring that every vehicle, every generator, and every piece of heavy machinery has the lifeblood it needs to function. In an environment where the heat alone can degrade equipment, the fuelers are the ones keeping the lights on and the wheels turning.
And Hernandez was very deliberate in the record about the conditions they faced. He noted that their work ensured critical systems remained operational in what he described as challenging and demanding environments. He wasn't speaking in generalities. He was referencing the literal desert conditions that define that theater of operations. He also took a moment to enter the names of the leadership into the record: Brigadier General Christopher B. Creedy and Colonel Laura Miller. It's a way of pinning the success of the mission to the people who oversaw the strategy behind it.
It's interesting how he framed the homecoming itself, too. He didn't focus on the tactical achievements or the number of gallons moved. Instead, he said, and I'm looking at the transcript here, "Homecoming is a moment filled with meaning. It is the embrace of loved ones, the familiarity of home, and the quiet understanding of all that has been given in service." That quiet understanding is a heavy phrase when you consider the unique position of Puerto Rican service members.
That's exactly the tension point. Puerto Rico has a massive footprint in the U.S. military. If you look at the historical data, the island has a long tradition of service, often at rates that outpace many states. But Hernandez, as the resident commissioner, represents over 3 million people, while holding a position that doesn't have a vote on the final passage of the very laws that send these units abroad. He can debate, he can work in committee, but when the bell rings for a floor vote on an authorization of military force, he doesn't have a button to push.
It creates a striking dynamic in the record. He is there to honor the shared sacrifice of these families, yet the political structure of that sacrifice remains lopsided. These soldiers serve a commander-in-chief they cannot vote for in the general election. Hernandez used the floor yesterday to bridge that gap with rhetoric, emphasizing that while their mission abroad is over, their place in the community is as strong as ever. He is essentially asserting their full citizenship through the lens of their service.
He also made a point to mention his role in their future. He told the House that he remains committed to supporting these veterans not just while they are in uniform, but as they transition back to civilian life. He specifically mentioned their reintegration, well-being, and continued success. That matters because the transition back to an island economy can look very different from the transition a veteran might face in, say, Ohio or Texas.
The geography is a factor. When the 204th returns to Puerto Rico, they are returning to a place where the cost of living, the healthcare infrastructure, and the job market are all shaped by the territory's specific relationship with the federal government. Hernandez is using his time on the floor to remind the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense that his office is watching that reintegration process closely. He's making it clear that the responsibility of the government doesn't end when the fuel trucks are parked.
There was a bilingual moment toward the end of his remarks that stood out in the transcript. He said, "To the service members, welcome home. Bienvenidos a casa." In the official record, those words sit side by side. It's a linguistic acknowledgement of the dual identity of these soldiers. They are integral parts of the U.S. Army, and they are sons and daughters of Puerto Rico.
It's a powerful way to end. It signals that their return strengthens the island. Hernandez is arguing that the experience and leadership these soldiers gained in the Middle East is now an asset for the community back home. He's framing the military as a pipeline for leadership within Puerto Rico, which is a common theme for resident commissioners who are trying to highlight the value the territory brings to the Union.
It also speaks to the role of the 1st Mission Support Command, which is based at Fort Buchanan. They are the only Army Reserve Command in the Caribbean. So when Hernandez honors a unit like the 204th, he's also honoring the infrastructure that allows Puerto Rico to project power and support missions thousands of miles away. It's a reminder that the island is a strategic hub, not just a recruitment center.
And the fueler aspect really shouldn't be overlooked. In modern warfare, energy is everything. By focusing on a transportation company, Hernandez is highlighting the old economy labor that makes high-tech warfare possible. You can have the most advanced drones and communication arrays, but if the 204th isn't there to fuel the generators, the screens go dark. He's giving credit to the people who do the dirty, heavy work that underpins the entire strategy.
The speech ended with a formal expression of gratitude on behalf of the people of Puerto Rico. It's a brief entry in the record, barely a few paragraphs, but it captures that complex intersection of military necessity, territorial status, and the personal relief of families. Hernandez is ensuring that the names of these soldiers and their specific contribution to the mission in the Middle East are preserved in the National Archives.
It sets a tone of civic pride that Hernandez clearly wants to carry into his other legislative work. If you're going to ask for more resources or a change in status for the island, starting with a reminder of the 204th service is a potent way to frame the conversation. It's a way of saying, we have done the work, we have shared the sacrifice, and now we are back home.
Exactly. It moves the conversation from abstract policy to the actual faces of the people who represent the island abroad. But as the 204th returns to the tropical humidity of Puerto Rico, the focus of the House shifted back to a very different kind of logistical challenge, one that involves the water rather than the desert.
That's right. While Hernandez was focused on the fuelers of the Middle East, a separate group of members was looking at the actual vessels that move that fuel and everything else across the globe. It's time for a deeper look at the rules of the sea.
Let's turn to what we're calling the Maritime Sidebar. The logistical movement of troops back to Puerto Rico that we were just discussing mirrors a larger, often invisible movement of goods and regulations across our coastal borders. While most of the oxygen in the capital yesterday, Thursday, was consumed by the high-stakes debate over the Department of Homeland Security, the House of Representatives was also busy refining the literal rules of the sea. It's a bit of a maritime sidebar to the main event, but as any port authority will tell you, the details in Title 46 of the United States Code are what actually keep the gears of global trade turning.
It's interesting how these things arrive in the Senate. According to the Congressional Record, at 7:02 a.m. yesterday, Thursday, a message from the House was delivered by a reading clerk, Mr. McLaughlin. Most people are still on their first cup of coffee at 7 in the morning, but the legislative machine was already handing over the work product of the previous session. They weren't just sending over one bill, they handed over a bundle that perfectly encapsulates the current tension between necessary routine and the heated politics of the border.
The record is very specific about that moment. It says, at 7:02 a.m., a message from the House of Representatives, delivered by Mr. McLaughlin, one of its reading clerks, announced that the House has passed the following bills, in which it requests the concurrence of the Senate. H.R. 7084, an act to amend Title 46, United States Code, and H.R. 8029, an act making appropriations for the Department of Homeland Security. It's that first one, H.R. 7084, that caught my eye. It focuses on the types of vessels that may enter or operate in navigable waters of the United States.
Navigable waters sounds like one of those broad, sweeping terms, but the legal definition is what determines who has the right to move cargo and where they can transfer it. If you look at the transcript of the underlying debate, there is this push to tighten the requirements for vessel operations. Why now? We've heard members, particularly a Republican from Louisiana, discuss the need for more transparency in how foreign-flagged vessels interact with our domestic infrastructure. It's not about stopping trade. It's about ensuring that every vessel entering a port under the jurisdiction of the United States meets a specific set of security and operational criteria.
And the timing is what makes it a sidebar to the DHS bill, H.R. 8029. While the House is setting these new maritime rules in H.R. 7084, they are also trying to figure out who is going to pay for the people who enforce them. The Coast Guard falls under DHS, and as we know, the Department of Homeland Security has been the center of a 42-day partial government shutdown that only recently saw a temporary resolution. The House passing H.R. 8029, their version of the full-year funding, is a signal that they want to move past the stopgap measures and set a definitive course for the rest of the 2026 fiscal year.
Wait, let's pull on that thread for a second. The House passed H.R. 8029 with a vote of 220 to 207. That is a fairly narrow margin, and it reflects the deep disagreement over what Homeland Security actually looks like in 2026. The Republican from Texas, who led the charge on this bill, framed it as America First spending. They are prioritizing things like physical border barriers and additional agents for immigration and customs enforcement. But in the Senate, the appetite for that specific mix is much lower. Senate Democrats have been very vocal about wanting to focus on the TSA and FEMA side of the ledger, while keeping ICE and Border Patrol funding at more restrained levels.
The tension is palpable in the record. The Senate previously passed a measure that restored funding for the TSA and the Coast Guard, but they pointedly left out the more controversial enforcement agencies. Now, the House has sent back H.R. 8029, which effectively puts those enforcement priorities back on the Senate's desk. It's a legislative game of chicken. By pairing the DHS appropriations with less controversial measures like H.R. 7084, the maritime regulations, the House is maintaining a steady clip of legislative output, essentially saying to the Senate, "We have done our job on all fronts. Now it's your turn."
If you look at the maritime bill specifically, H.R. 7084, it deals with cargo transfers in any port or place under the jurisdiction of the United States. That phrasing is key. It's not just the big ports like Long Beach or Savannah. It's any place. This could involve ship-to-ship transfers out in the water, which have long been a bit of a blind spot for regulators. The bill seeks to amend Title 46 to clarify which types of vessels are even allowed to perform those transfers. It seems like a technicality, but it's actually a major piece of the economic security puzzle.
It really is about closing those gaps. A Democrat from Washington State pointed out during the committee markup that without these updates, we are essentially using mid-20th century rules for a 21st century global shipping fleet. These ships are larger, the cargo is more complex, and the ownership structures are often layered through multiple international subsidiaries. H.R. 7084 is an attempt to peel back some of those layers before a ship even enters the harbor.
And yet we see this recurring theme where these essential updates get overshadowed. The maritime bill moved through with relatively little fanfare because everyone was looking at the 7:02 a.m. arrival of the DHS bill. It's a classic move in the House. Move the factory work quietly while the firefight work takes the headlines. But if you think about it, the Coast Guard is the one tasked with enforcing H.R. 7084. If the DHS funding fight in H.R. 8029 isn't resolved, the Coast Guard's ability to actually implement these new maritime regulations becomes incredibly strained.
That's a great point. You can pass all the Title 46 amendments you want, but if the personnel aren't there to conduct the inspections because of a funding lapse or a shift in priorities, the law is just words on a page. The record also shows that the House agreed to the Senate's amendment to H.R. 7147, the Consolidated Appropriations Bill, but with another amendment of their own. This is the ping-pong phase of the budget. They are haggling over the final details of a massive spending package that includes DHS, trying to avoid sliding back into another shutdown scenario.
I noticed a quote from a Republican from Ohio who mentioned that the House has now passed all 12 of the individual appropriations bills. That is a significant milestone for leadership. They want to show that the House is a functioning factory, as you put it. By sending H.R. 7084 and H.R. 8029 together, they are presenting a unified front of we are regulating the borders, we are funding the agencies, and we are updating the laws of the sea. It's a very deliberate narrative they are sending over to the Senate reading clerk.
It also highlights the shift in focus since the 42-day shutdown ended. There's a certain urgency now. The record doesn't show a lot of time for grandstanding on these specific maritime provisions. It shows a House that is clearing its decks. They want these bills in the Senate's hands, so the pressure shifts. When Mr. McLaughlin read that message at 7:02 a.m., he was effectively starting the clock for the Senate to respond before the next funding deadline looms.
It's a lot to keep track of, but that's the reality of the floor. 1 minute you're talking about the 204th Regional Support Group returning to Puerto Rico, and the next you're looking at the technical amendments to Title 46 regarding cargo transfer operations. It all connects back to how the country manages its borders, whether those borders are in the middle of the desert or 10 miles out at sea.
And that is where we leave it for today. The House has finished its work for the week. The bills are in the Senate's court, and the reading clerks have earned their weekend. We'll be watching the Senate on Monday to see if they take up H.R. 7084 or if it gets caught in the larger gravity well of the DHS funding battle.
Exactly. The maritime rules might be the sidebar, but sometimes the sidebar tells you more about the health of the institution than the headline. We'll be back on Monday to see which way the tide is turning. For Floor Notes Extended, I'm Reed.
And I'm Paige. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time. Wait, Reed, before we actually step away, there's one last detail from the record yesterday, Thursday, that really frames the stakes for the next few weeks.
The transcript shows a pretty stark situation as the chamber cleared out. As senators head home for recess, they leave behind a DHS that is effectively a house divided, half-funded, half-shuttered, and governed by Rule 14 maneuvers rather than a compromise.
It's a heavy note to end on, but it's where the logistics stand. It seems in today's Congress, the only thing everyone can agree on is that they'll see each other in mid-April.
A bipartisan consensus on the departure gate, if nothing else. We'll be right here to see if that unity holds when the funding debate resumes.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll catch you when the gavel returns.